You can go ahead and be turning in your Bibles to John chapter 18. We're going to pick up where we left off last week. We were talking about Jesus' 6 trials between his arrest around midnight, early Friday morning, to his going to the cross at around and being put on the cross about 9 a.m. Before that, of course, is the scourging, which we may get to tonight. But he went through 6 trials, and without recapping the first 3 that we covered last week, we'll just say the first 3 were the Jewish trials, where he went to Annas, Caiaphas, and in the Sanhedrin. And they, even though he was innocent, they found him guilty of blasphemy, for they pinpointed and came right out and asked him, are you the Son of God? And they put him under oath. So whenever he responded under oath, because he had to, then they said, we don't need to hear anything further. Now it's time to transfer to what we began with for the last 5 or 10 minutes of the session last week, and that is now for the 3 Roman trials. He'll go to Pilate, then he'll be shifted to Herod, and then he'll come back to Pilate. And when the second visit with Pilate is when the pronouncement is made to go ahead and have him scourged. So we pick up in John chapter 18. We'll get to the verse in just a moment. We noted last week that Pilate, normally he's a Roman governor or procurator. You've heard procurator, governor, same thing. Just like we have governors of our states in America, these 40 Roman provinces each had a governor. And that is a kingdom aspect, which we'll get to at another time. But I would just happen to throw that in there while we're at it, because the kingdom has a governor too from the get-go. But that's another teaching. But here he is in charge of all legal matters, and he is the supreme authority over all legal matters. Caesar doesn't want to hear anything. He says, I gave you a job to do. Y'all handle any and all legal matters in your territory. That was Pilate's job. Well, because of that, and because of the opposition and so forth and so on, a procurator's job only was about 1 to 3 years, and they would be reassigned to somewhere else. But here he is already twice that long in tenure. So they're getting sick of him already, especially the Jews. The Jews have had enough of him because the Romans have absolutely nothing to do for the Jewish customs. They could care less about their feast. They could care less about their traditions. They feel disrespected. So they don't want anything to do with Rome. But they have to employ Rome here because, as we will see, and as they noted, that they themselves cannot authorize a crucifixion. The Romans who do the scourging, who do the crucifixion, they're the ones. In a Roman court, it has to be ordered. They themselves couldn't order it in the Sanhedrin. The best they can do is stoning. But they want him to be publicly humiliated on a cross. So therefore, they got to begin with Pilate because he is the local authority. They can't go straight to Herod. They got to go to Pilate first. You got to follow the chain of command. Now, Pilate was used to dealing with crimes. Everything's cut and dry. You come in, this is your offense, okay, and he assigns the verdict. He assigns the sentencing that is comparable to the crime. He may hear a little bit of the case in prosecution and defense, but not a whole lot. Everything's pretty cut and dry. But he knows good and well with dealing with these religious people, he's going to have to do something he hates doing, and that's listen to all their drama. He doesn't want to deal with it, okay? He doesn't have no respect for them to begin with, but he definitely don't want to deal with their drama. So we pick up in chapter 18 of John, verse 28, and we'll read through verse 32. They led Jesus, therefore, from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early, and they themselves did not enter into the praetorium, in order that they might not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. So these Jewish leaders who took him to Pilate's place, they didn't dare go in, because it is the Passover. And they're so conscientious of Sabbaths, they're so conscientious of Passovers, and they mean well. They really do. They mean well. They want to be holy. But in the process of that, when they got their coveted attention being given to someone else, they become jealous. The leaven of Herod rises up. So what's overriding that is their hate for Jesus. Okay, so they're going to take him to Pilate, but then again, they're not going to go in because they don't know what kind of idols he's got in his house. They don't know what kind of, he might have some harlots in there for all they know. And they don't want to be exposed to all that. So they're going to stay outside. But they go take him to his doorstep, and keep in mind, it's at the daybreak. Because we read last week, this is at daybreak. I don't know what time Pilate gets up, but he certainly don't want to be dealing with him first thing in the morning before he's had his coffee. Okay? And then verse 29, Pilate therefore went out to them. In other words, he sees them out there and they're not coming in. He's got to go out there to him. That don't make him happy. And said, what accusation do you bring against this man? They answered and said to him, if this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you. They're saying, we got good reason for bringing him to you. And Pilate saying, you better have good reason for bringing him to me. Pilate therefore said to them, take him yourselves and judge him according to your law. The Jews said to him, we are not permitted to put anyone to death, that the word of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what kind of death he was about to die. Jesus had already referred to what type of death he was going to die back in John 12, verses 27 through 33, if you're taking notes. You can read back where he mentioned what type of death. He even told the disciples, I'll be delivered into their hands and I'll be crucified. He's already told them what kind of death he's going to go to. But you notice what Pilate says. He says in verse 31, he tries to defer it back to the Sanhedrin. Why can't you just take it back to your court? It's a religious matter. You're religious people. I'm a judicial guy. You just handle it. And then they come right out. So as we noted, we got ahead of ourselves a little bit. In verse 32, and they said, but we are not authorized to order an execution by crucifixion. So that's where we pick up here. Here's where the politics are going to come into the play. They're going to Pilate, and these religious leaders, they're not dumb. They've got a ploy here. The first thing we want to see is they want to see Jesus judged by a Roman court. Now, they can't use the same charge that they themselves found guilty of. They found him guilty of blasphemy. That means nothing in a Roman court. That didn't mean a thing to them. He could claim to be the Son of God all he wants, and as far as Pilate is concerned, Herod's concerned, Caesar is concerned, they could care less. That's why he's saying, take him back to your court. You're the one who got a problem with him. We don't. Pilate's later go say, I find no fault in him. Getting ahead of ourselves again. Okay? But they've got a plan here. They want to see Jesus' reputation ruined. Because remember we said the leaven of Herod. The leaven of Herod says when one's coveted attention is given to another. And when he raised Lazarus from the dead, that was the icing on the cake. They say he's out of control. There's no way we're going to stop him now. The fact that there's a man walking around that he raised from the dead, it's one thing that he raised 2 kids from the dead. We can classify that as just resuscitation. But this grown man who'd been dead for 4 days, there's no way we can explain this away. And yet he's walking around testifying of this. We got to kill him. That's what they're thinking. But in the process, if they wanted to kill him, they could have just stoned him. They want him to his reputation to be ruined. In addition to that, they have a political backup plan in place. We'll get to in just a moment. And they figured if we can ruin Jesus' reputation before the people, then it would vindicate us and we can tell them, we tried to tell you about that guy. We tried to tell you. We tried to warn you. Y'all wouldn't listen. Okay, now you see, he's a criminal. He's dying on a cross. Y'all can come on back to church now. That's what they're thinking. So they're going to falsify charges against him, against Jesus. Again, in their court, blasphemy. That's not going to wash in a Roman court. So they're going to have to come up with the charge of he claims to be a king. Because then that would be a political threat. All right? Now in Luke chapter 23, beginning in verse 2, it says, and they began to accuse him, saying, we found this fellow, and they're going to mention 3 things here, 3 charges that they're going to try to trump up against him. Number 1, perverting the nation. Now that's more of a religious Sanhedrin charge than a Roman matter, but they throw it in there anyway. Number 2, forbidding to give tribute to Caesar. Now they're fabricating this because you know good and well, even in Matthew 22, verses 17 through 22, Jesus himself said, give me a coin. Whose image is on it? Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. Jesus never once told them, don't pay your taxes. But now they go falsify charges and accuse him of that to see if they can make him stick. See if they can convince him of it. And then thirdly, saying that he himself is Christ a king. That's what they were leading up to. Because then anybody in politics is going to perceive that as a threat to the throne. Maybe not their throne, but Caesar's throne, and that's who they answer to. Okay? So now we're back to John 18. Let's pick back up in verse 33. It says, therefore Pilate entered again into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, are you the king of the Jews? He gets straight to the point. Here again, he's used to being cut and dry. He don't want to hear all kinds of drama. He don't want to beat around the bush. He knows good and well that they just launched a charge that Christ is king. So he'd go, okay, let's go and get to the matter so I can go and get this case dismissed, get it out of my courtroom so I can have my breakfast. So he comes up to him and says, are you the king of the Jews? Once again, he doesn't say, I am. Because here again, you saw what happened in the garden. He says, it is as you say. It is as you say. In some translations, verse 34, are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me? Okay? Now, what Pilate is going to figure out here is in the midst of previously in Luke 23, when they're launching all these charges against Jesus, he's used to a courtroom where when somebody, a plaintiff, goes and files a charge, the defendant automatically speaks up. That's a lie. That's not true. He's used to this jarring back and forth. They make a charge, somebody immediately speaks up. That's not true. That's a lie. I didn't do that. I'm innocent. He's used to that, just like People's Court, like you see on TV. Some of these ones, they're arguing back and forth. Okay? But he's amazed at the fact that in Matthew's version, it says in Matthew 27:11, he says, are you the king of the Jews? And that's where Jesus says, it is as you say. Now, you got to understand something. Pilate finds it very odd that Jesus does not defend himself with the charges. The charges we just mentioned. He doesn't defend himself. Pilate even asked in Matthew, let me just flip to Matthew 27. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor questioned him, saying, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus said to him, it is as you say. And while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he made no answer. So we listed the 3 main charges, but they ain't no telling what else they're saying about him. Then Pilate said to him, do you not hear how many things they testify against you? So how many things? That means there were several charges they were launching against him. And he did not answer him with regard to even a single charge, so that the governor was quite amazed. He was quite amazed. It says in Matthew 27:14 that he marveled greatly. That word in Greek means he was at a loss for words. So Pilate's used to coming in, everything cut and dry. And he asked him, do you not defend yourself over a single charge? And Jesus remained silent. And then Pilate's probably silent. He's probably sitting there thinking. He's puzzled that Jesus wouldn't try and defend himself. So what astonished Pilate about Jesus? Well, there's a natural reason here that we see that Jesus didn't try and defend himself. Now that's important. It's not just a matter of Jesus' demeanor that catches him off guard, but he has been hurled several charges against him. And here's what we need to understand. In the Roman court back in that day, you were given 3 chances to defend yourself. And if you did not defend yourself, or you could not defend yourself, on the 3 occasions you were given, then the governor had a right to declare you guilty. And Jesus kept his mouth shut. He wasn't about to defend himself, because we saw in 1 Peter 2:23, he says he just turned it all over to the Lord, the one who judges righteously. So now we got all the players in place here, because he could proceed and just automatically find Jesus guilty and move on for passing up on the 3 chances. But there is a soulish reason, I would argue, that Pilate is hesitant to declare him guilty. Because he probably saw something in Jesus' eyes. He probably saw his gentle demeanor, unlike any other person that's been in his courtroom before, and that probably intrigued Pilate. Besides that, as you men can testify, sometimes your wife has an influence on you. So does Pilate's wife. A strong argument could be made that even Pilate's wife was secretly a follower of Jesus. Look in Matthew 27 and verse 19. We were just there in Matthew 27. Let's go back to that in verse 19. It says, "And while he was sitting on the judgment seat, where he renders verdicts, his wife sent to him saying, 'Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for last night I suffered greatly in a dream because of him.'" What does that mean? Did she have a nightmare? Did she have a nightmare during the night that the Lord was really impressing upon her that this Jesus, whom she's a secret follower of her, he's in some dear trouble here? But she sends a message to him. But beyond that, back in John 18, as we read in verses 33 through 38, Pilate therefore entered again into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered and said to him, "Are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me?" Now that'll preach. Are you asking the question because you believe I'm the king? Or are you asking me because you or other people say I'm the king? I think that is a profound statement, that he turns it right back around and directs it directly at the governing authority over the land. He turns it right back around and says, "Are you asking me because you actually believe?" Jesus probably already knew. Your wife does. Did she get to you? What have you heard about me? Has she told you about me? Obviously, she sent him a message. Okay? Now see, that right there will preach. And then it says, Pilate answered, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests delivered you up to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered. And now he has to answer now, because it's like he's been put under oath again. But besides that, he has to answer because he's now asking him a kingdom question. All the other charges, Jesus is not going to defend himself. But the moment you bring up king and kingdom, that right there is the heart and soul of his gospel. The gospel of the kingdom. So he has to speak up, because now is my opportunity to testify to this man. He said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting." Remember the Garden of Gethsemane, put your swords away? "That I might not be delivered up to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." Pilate therefore said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is the truth?" What is the truth? Okay? Now, when he said this in verse 38, "And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no fault in him. I find no guilt in him." That is not what these Jewish leaders were wanting to hear. So now it's time to back Pilate into a corner. This is where the politics come in. The religious leader says, okay, you want to play the political game? We can whip out the political card as well. And here's where they do it. See, they wanted him judged by a Roman court, so he would go through public humiliation. But then they had a second plan. They figured if he won't crucify Jesus, then at least we can get Pilate removed. And maybe the next governor will. They're going to back him into the corner and they're going to present this to Pilate. Did you ask him, is he a king? What did he say? Did he admit it? Well, yeah, he did. Okay, is that not treason? Does that not constitute treason? He's now a traitor to the Roman Empire because of what he says. Now, if Pilate sets Jesus free, that's not plan A for them, but it does satisfy plan B. Plan B is to get Pilate out of office. Because after all, he's been standing in our way all this time. So what they do now is they're going to threaten Pilate. They're going to threaten Pilate. They have a backup plan. Now, they have a backup plan as it is because they could always take him back to the Sanhedrin and rule that he needs to be stoned to death. So they can still kill him. But they want him embarrassed. Our plan A is to have him humiliated as a thief on a cross. That's what we want. Either way, he's dying. But by Pilate already having said, back in verse 32, he said, why don't you take him back to your court? Well, they've already gotten permission. They can go back to the Sanhedrin, the Council of 71, and said, look, Pilate wouldn't put him on the cross, but he gave us permission to kill him by stoning. That's the only way they could do it. So they realized that he's going to die one way or the other. But they figured, let's go ahead and play the political game while we're at it. And this is where they back Pilate into a corner. They're saying, if you do not declare him guilty somehow, some way, then we're going to tell Caesar. We're going to send a message to Caesar that a man under your jurisdiction is claiming to be king and you let him walk out of your courtroom. That is not going to sit well with Caesar, and you're going to lose your job. That's the political game. Sounds like what we got going on in America now, right? It still was played back here. So he's got a predicament here. On one hand, if he orders him crucified, he keeps his job. He made him happy. I get to keep my job. Whew. But on the other hand, because of all these reservations he has of not declaring him guilty, that could cost him his job. So he's in a predicament. So he needed a loophole. He finds that loophole in Luke chapter 23. Pilate is sweating now. He's backed into a corner. Remember, it says he was quiet there for a moment because he's sitting there contemplating. If I do it, this is what's going to happen. If I don't do it, this is what's going to happen. He's weighing the pros and cons here. We're in Luke chapter 23, beginning in verse 4. And Pilate said to the chief priests and the multitudes, I find no guilt in this man. We read that a while ago. But they kept on insisting, saying, he stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee, even as far as this place. But when Pilate heard, notice what it just said in verse 5. He stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee. They said he began his ministry in Galilee. He's from Galilee. His hometown is Galilee. And he says, from there all the way to your door, he's been preaching. But when Pilate heard it, he asked whether or not the man was a Galilean. And when he heard that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was in Jerusalem at the time. Pilate was on his throne because it's the Passover. I'm going to have all kinds of uprising, fights, all kinds of mobs and everything else going on. especially when money changers are trying to rip people off in the temple with their sacrifices. I'm gonna have a docket full. Well, not only that, but because of the crowd of people in the Passover, Herod is in town. He's not vacationing. He's not visiting anywhere else. He makes sure he's in town. So he finds a loophole. He says, okay, I may get off the hook here. I can defer it to Herod. And if Herod puts him on the cross, then I keep my job and they don't go run into Caesar. Okay? And yet they still get what they want and they out of my hair. So he wants to defer it to Herod. Now, which Herod is it? Which Herod is it? Herod the Great, that we know of when Jesus was born, he died in 4 BC. We've talked about that at Christmas time. That's why Jesus had to have been born 6 to 7 BC. Had to be. Because before he died in 4 BC, he ordered that all males 2 years of age and younger be killed. So therefore, Jesus had to be about 2 when that edict was given. So therefore, Jesus had to be born 6 to 7 BC. So the calendar's off. Because we know for written history, just like we know Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, just like we know 1776, they know that he died in 4 BC. Now, the kingdom was then divided among his 3 sons, and all 3 of his sons were named Herod. There was Herod Archelaus. He ruled until 6 AD. But he was the Herod when Joseph, Mary, and Jesus returned from Egypt. That's who was on the throne, Herod Archelaus, that son. But he was so hated by the Jews that they literally ran him off. Because the Jews and the Samaritans both complained to Caesar, as they were threatening to do, with Pilate. They both complained to Caesar, and he was banished to Gaul, and he died in 18 AD. All right? So now, the kingdom is divided. But there's another Herod, Herod Philip, another son. He ruled the distant regions as east of the Jordan and east of the Sea of Galilee. So he's in another territory. That only leaves Herod Antipas. And that's the Herod that he's sending him to. Antipas. Anti means against. Pas means everyone. He's against everybody. He's a hard-nosed joker. Okay? He's against everybody, but yet he tried to appeal to people to make himself more popular, just like what we see here today. Now, here's the issue with Herod Antipas. Now, this is going to bring some other recent events in talking about in Jesus' day come to mind. Herod Antipas, his first marriage, he married the daughter of an Arabian leader. Okay, that's because a lot of times kings and nobility would marry royalty from another land to try to keep peace. So he married the daughter of an Arabian leader. But he divorced her so he could marry the ex-wife of his half-brother. Her name was Herodias. Y'all have heard the name from all the biblical movies. She was the ex-wife of his half-brother. Now, that wasn't uncommon for you to marry the ex-wife of a half-brother. They did that a lot. Herodias was also the daughter of yet another half-brother named Aristobulus. So she was the ex-wife of one half-brother. She was the daughter of another half-brother. Now, marrying the daughter of a half-brother wasn't that uncommon either. But what was very unusual is for both. The ex-wife of one, the daughter of another. Well, guess who had a problem with that? Guess who called him out on that? John the Baptist. And that's why John the Baptist was beheaded. Because Herodias, his wife, ordered it. Y'all remember that, right? That's why. That's what got John the Baptist in trouble. He called him out publicly for divorcing your wife that you had to marry someone who is kin to you twice. That's uncalled for. It rubbed John the Baptist the wrong way, and that's why he spoke up. And that's what got him killed. Now, if you will, turn to Luke 23, which is where we were just at, or at least I was just at. Pick up in verse 8. Now Herod was very glad when he saw Jesus, because they sent him to Jesus. And he wanted to see him for a long time, because he had been hearing about him and was hoping to see some sign performed by him. That's important. It says he had heard a lot about Jesus. He had probably heard a lot from his daddy. But more recently, he had heard about his miracles. But from his daddy as a kid, he probably heard about this guy who was born in Bethlehem. He probably heard about the wise men who came to visit. He probably heard stories about my daddy chased this guy all over the country trying to kill him. All into Egypt. And now this is the same man my daddy tried to kill. He had those other children killed in an attempt to get him, and he's still alive, and now he's coming to see me. This is a narrative here. This means something to Herod. And it says, secondly, he wanted to see some sign performed by him. He wanted Jesus to perform a miracle in front of him. He wanted him just to entertain him. And when Jesus wouldn't, the tables are turned. All of a sudden, Herod gets ticked off. Verse 9, and he questioned Jesus at length, and he answered him nothing. Here again, Jesus didn't defend himself. And the chief priests and the scribes were standing there, accusing him vehemently. Now that word vehemently, we know what vehemently means, but even in the Greek, it means to scream at full volume. They were raising their voice and they were hurling accusations against Jesus right there in Herod's court. They called him a fraud. They were saying, some miracle worker you are. You're nothing but a charlatan. Okay, and then what happens? When they settle down, maybe Herod said, okay, calm down. And they proceed. Verse 11, and Herod with his soldiers, after treating him with contempt, okay, we'll get back to that in a second, and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him back to Pilate. Now Herod and Pilate became friends with one another that very day, for before they had been at enmity with each other. Okay? So it says that his men of war, which means his bodyguards, his officers, they set at naught. That means they made fun of him, they mocked him, they belittled him, they played games at his expense, as we talked about before. I mean, you pretend to be a miracle worker. They probably acted out Jesus healing somebody or somebody falling on the floor. I don't know what all they did. But they really acted very immature. Now look in verse 11. They clothed him with a royal robe and sent him back to Pilate. Now where did he get this robe from? It was probably an extra robe hanging in the closet somewhere. They put a royal robe and sent it back to him. And of course, Herod probably appreciated the fact that Pilate deferred him to him. I've been wanting to see him. Remember it says he was very glad when he saw him. So maybe that's what helped them become friends. Pilate thought enough. He already heard that I wanted to see him. So he sent him to me, gave me an opportunity. Although he didn't perform a miracle for me like I wanted, but at least he acknowledged the fact and gave me an opportunity. Okay, now in chapter 23, verse 13. So he sends him back to Pilate. And Pilate summoned the chief priests and the rulers and the people and said to them, you brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion. That's what you claim. And behold, I've examined him before you. I have found no guilt in this man regarding the charges which you make against him. What you're claiming against him, I can't see it. I don't see it. There's no reason for me to declare him guilty. No, nor has Herod, for he sent him back to us. And behold, nothing deserving death has been done by this man. I will therefore punish him and release him. I will punish him. He's offering to scourge him right now. Now, if they would have taken him up on this offer to scourge him, it probably would have been a minor scourging. just like they've done before. Okay, I'll get ahead of myself and let you know this. In this court, in Pilate's court, you have a criminal standing before them. Probably dependent upon the degree of the crime. They're either going to be ordered to be scourged, settle yourself down, okay? And they would scourge him to try to get him to stop. Or they would crucify him, but not both. Jesus is the only person that we know of to be both scourged and crucified. Okay? That right there says a lot in itself. Then they start in on releasing Barabbas because even he mentions it himself. It says in verse 17, now he was obliged to release to them at the feast one prisoner. He recalls that, hey, I got an opportunity to release him. Why not I just release Jesus? I don't find any fault in him. He's gone through the legal system, which is what y'all brought him to me for. I'm the governing authority. I say there's no fault in him. So I'm offering to release him. But they cried out all together, saying, away with this man, and release for us Barabbas. He was one who had been thrown into prison for a certain insurrection made in the city and for murder. And Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again. But they kept on calling out, saying, crucify him, crucify him. Okay? So now you see what's going on here, where Pilate is trying his best. He said, just let me whip him and release him. But they would not stop. They would determine Jesus is going to die at the hands of the Romans. Now look what it says there. It says they kept on calling out, crucify him, crucify him. And he said to them the third time. Remember, Jesus was given 3 opportunities to defend himself? Pretty interesting that Pilate responds by declaring 3 times, I find no fault in this man. He says, and he said to them a third time, why? What evil has this man done? I have found in him no guilt demanding death. I will therefore punish him and release him. But they were insistent with loud voices, asking that he be crucified, and their voices began to prevail. What does that mean? They kept getting louder and louder and louder and louder and louder. And Pilate pronounced sentence that their demand should be granted. And he released the man they were asking for, who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, but he delivered Jesus to their will. They were claiming that Jesus is guilty of treason, claiming to be a king. And yet they want to release a man who had already been declared guilty of treason for an insurrection and murder on top of that. Jesus had murdered nobody. So now what does Pilate do? We got to go back to Matthew chapter 27. The very familiar, you know what he's going to do, but we just got to read it for the sake of staying in sequence here. In Matthew chapter 27, verse 24. And when Pilate saw that he was accomplishing nothing, because they kept in the previous verse saying they kept shouting and kept getting louder and louder and louder. Let him be crucified. And when he saw he was accomplishing nothing, but rather than a riot was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the multitude, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to that yourselves. And all the people answered and said, now you got to listen to what he just said. What they're about to say here. This is absolutely horrible, what they go say here. It says that he washed his hands. Okay, now washing his hands is a public statement. Okay, it is a way of declaring I'm innocent in this matter. I find no fault in him, but make no mistake about it, Pilate says, if y'all insist on him dying, his blood's not going to be in my hands because, for the record, I find no fault in him. But they kept getting louder and louder and louder and louder. And the people answered and said, his blood be on us and our children. Whoa. Now, these are religious leaders, right? Surely they knew, they taught the law, did they not? They knew Exodus 20 and verse 5, during the Ten Commandments, it says, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the 3rd and 4th generation of them that hate me. They were declaring, they were cursing themselves. They were declaring not only a curse upon their own lives, but upon their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, their great-grandchildren. That's how much they hated Jesus. It'll make you shake your head, does it not? They're announcing an own curse upon themselves. Talk about religious ignorance. It says Pilate would then have Jesus scourged and then sent to be crucified. And again, he's the only person we know of in history to be both Roman scourged and crucified. We can get into the Roman scourging. We may not finish it, but we can get into it. There's a huge difference between a Jewish scourging and a Roman scourging. A big difference. A Roman scourging would leave you half dead. A Jewish scourging would not. After all, we see in 2 Corinthians 11, verse 24, Paul himself says this, 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. And he survived that. So that tells you 39 lashes from the Jews wasn't that, it was painful, but it wasn't threatening to kill you. Okay? Now, let me explain something because I know you've heard this. And let me go ahead and address it. You've heard that said that there was a Jewish law, and it is in Deuteronomy chapter 25 and verse 3. And it says that a man could not be beaten with more than 40 lashes. So what they did was, the Jews, mind you, is when they beat, like they did with Paul, what did Paul said? He received from them 39 lashes on 5 different occasions. They would stop 1 lash short. You've heard it said, and I've even heard it said that there are 39 major diseases. So Jesus, we know by his stripes we're healed. That sounds good. But I got news for you. Jesus wasn't beaten 39 times. They didn't stop at 39. That was a Jewish law. And the Jews didn't beat him. The Romans did. And they had no such law. And they could care less about Jewish law. So that whole issue of the 39, there are some very respectable ministers that to this day will continue to maintain that. And I'm not talking against them or nothing like that. I'm just saying, I myself, there are things that I don't have revelation of yet. And I say, Lord, if I'm not in full revelation of certain things, then show me so I can teach it accurately. Likewise, they evidently hadn't stopped to think. The Romans were the ones who beat him, not the Jews. Paul suffered 5 occasions, 39 lashes, and still walked away from it. Jesus was in not that kind of a shape when he got finished the Roman scourging. They got a kick out of it. That's what the Romans did. They got a kick out of it. Paul also went on to say in 2 Corinthians 11:25 that he was thrice beaten with rods. Remember last week it said they beat him with rods? We're going to see it again after the scourging. He is beaten with rods. Do you understand what it means to be beaten with rods in that day? In that day, to be beaten with rods, they would like lay you down on your stomach, and they would kick your legs up in the air, and they would tie you together to where your feet are kicking up in the air like this. And they would take rods and they would go to whacking on the bottom of your feet. That's what it meant to be beaten with rods. Paul was beaten with rods because he was doing what? He was going from one city to the other city to the next city as an apostle, preaching the gospel of the kingdom. And they were determined to put a stop to all this journeying around. So they said, in order to get from place to place, you don't have an automobile. Okay? In order to get from place to place, you got to walk. So we're going to mess up your feet. And that's what beaten with rods means. That they just hammered and hammered. Paul was such a deformed, he even tells it. He says, I'm not impressive to anybody. Paul had been beaten up so many times, in prison so many times. He was an ugly looking rascal. But nonetheless, he was beaten by Jews. Jesus is beaten by the Romans. Okay? In Matthew 27:67, we'll get to, in Mark 14:65, the footnote says that Jesus was possibly beaten with rods. We'll get to that because that happens after the scourging. A scourge was called a flagello, Phragelllo. Okay? Now, this particular scourge people were familiar with because this scourge was the most fierce weapon outside of a sword or a spear that could be used. It was the worst type of thing that you could whip with, was a Roman scourge, because of what all it was laced with. In fact, if we had Roman scourging today, we'd have a lot less problems. If our court system could order a scourging today, our jails and prisons wouldn't be as full as they are. People would think twice before committing a crime. Because remember, Pilate even said, just let me have him scourged. Well, if a Roman officer is laden with all the heavy armor, is he not? There's a sword on his side. Just like a sheriff's deputy or a policeman has a gun on their side. Does that stop people from breaking the law? No. But I got news for you. If they ever pulled out a Roman scourge, that would break up a riot quicker than anything. Because they could just go wailing it. And you talk about people scattering and going home, dropping their issue and whatever argument they had going on, you let them pull out a Roman scourge. It was so feared because they had seen what a Roman scourge would do to a human body. Even the threat of a scourging could calm a crowd. Now, only women and Roman citizens were exempt from a scourging. Okay? That's why you remember Paul encounters this. In Acts 22, I think it is. They go to whip him thinking he is Saul, the former Jew, not realizing he has Roman citizenship because his daddy bought him Roman citizenship before he was born. So Paul was born both a Jew and a Roman. He had dual citizenship. And when they tie him up and they're getting ready to whip him, then he says, is it lawful for you to scourge a Roman citizen? And they go, whoa, time out. You're a Roman citizen? Yes. My daddy purchased a citizenship long ago before I was born, and therefore he had citizenship at the time of my birth. Therefore, I'm also a Roman citizen. So you didn't whip women and you didn't scourge Roman citizens. Okay, and we got to stop because we're out of time for tonight. But we'll pick up with this because we're going to get into next week the scourging, because there's more details to the scourging. How it fulfills Old Testament prophecy. Besides Isaiah 53. There are other Psalms, there are other in Isaiah, there are other scriptures that prophesied of how extensive this beating was. And then we will get to what happens after the scourging, having to do with the crown of thorns. And then the trip to Golgotha. We'll cover that next week, and then we can get on to what actually happens on the cross. Because it's going to take us a whole week to cover what happens on the cross. Because there's so much physically that happens on the cross, but there's even more spiritually speaking that happens on the cross.